I used to live in the old Herman Sayward house on Oak Street in Alfred. There were whispers, shadows, and nightly mumbled conversations downstairs. I never considered myself clairvoyant, although I've had many experiences with the paranormal since I was 3 years old. But something kept coming through so strong at that house in Alfred that I couldn't ignore it. At first, I couldn't stop obsessing over all things German. This was out of the blue. I would see vivid images in my head of Germany, though I'd never been there, nor had I ever had any interest in the culture or country. Then I started hearing the language in my head. Since I had just finished working on a book that I was writing, I was eager to begin another. So, I made my main character German. Here's where it gets interesting. Every night that I'd work on that book, I would see shadows, hear slight bangs and taps around in the downstairs office, and more whispers. I didn't get unnerved too much until I started seeing more images in my mind with very vivid details. It was sometime back in the 1800s. I saw people in period clothing and a man with very intense eyes. And every time it was the same man and the same people around. Something about him scares me. He seems insistent on telling me something, so I listen. I can't always understand what I'm hearing, as it is in German, and he's talking too fast, and he's upset at times, so I decided to learn the language. Herman Sayward built his house in the later 1800s and had a nursery business. Now, when I did research on the house and Herman, there were records that he had employed German immigrants. I couldn't find out much about those immigrants, but I did find out that there were a lot of Germans that had come to southern Maine to settle. There were lots of stories of brutality of the Indians in the Alfred area, and a particularly violent case of a young woman who had been scalped by the Indians as a warning to the white men. This happened just down the street from the Herman Sayward house, and I believe it could have been around the time Herman Sayward was living at his house on Oak Street. The reason why I mention this case is because of the odd rituals that have also been done in and around this area. I never got a chance to explore that avenue of rituals any further, as life had other plans for me, and I had to move out of Alfred after a year and a half. But when I was packing up my stuff, I happened to explore under the old barn. It's a huge 3-story barn. There was a dugout area of dirt under the barn, just beyond where they would have parked their carriages. I slid under there for God knows what reason, and there were bones wrapped in twine or small rope and deliberately hung up under the old eaves of the barn. They looked like chicken bones, but I've seen stuff like that in books, and it felt evil to me. I got out of there and left all of that behind, except for the nagging German guy. I kept hearing him whenever I would work on my book, but I had to ignore him because life was busy until now. 14 years later, I dusted off my old book notes and decided to start writing that book again, maybe finish it. And guess who's back? With more information? The German guy. Only it got more intense. I started getting complete German sentences. Over the years, I had let my knowledge for the language fade, and I never learned the proper grammar and sentence structure. So where is this coming from? I wrote it down whenever it came through, and it was all accurate, in proper grammar. I had to use my translator. It was some very beautiful writings of love and heartache. This started in October 2022 and is still going on. Over this time, the images have become so clear, but I don't really know who he is. I have found him to not always be truthful. He has told me his name is Wilhelm. I've seen those images again. Only there's something going on at a very elaborate party on a lake. There is some sort of tragedy, a drowning, that occurred at the lake. I don't know if what I'm seeing is in Alfred or Germany, or maybe it's just some place that reminds him of Germany. I wish I knew who he was, because he's always around. Even my entire family are witnessing things in our house. We've been seeing shadows, a black, blob-like form move in front of us and then disappear. Strong wafts of cologne, touches, pokes, hair tugs, shaking or vibrating beds, whispering, breathing, footsteps. Weird things happen with devices and appliances. This doesn't occur every day, and there are periods where it's either very quiet or very eerie and active. But the shadows and whitish gray wisps are always around. They don't feel threatening in any way, but it would be nice to know why they are here and what they're trying to say. I do use methods to communicate with whomever is coming through, like dowsing rods, tarot cards, and automatic writing. I also use the modern-day apps like Spirit Talker, GhostTube SLS, and others that are similar. I don't trust the modern ones as much as the older methods, but they can be of use and are sometimes very accurate. The only thing that bothers me about the attachment is how strong he feels about sticking with me to tell me something, yet drags out telling me all that I want to know. I feel that if I had more information, perhaps on those German immigrants, I could learn who was so desperately trying to tell me something. Or maybe I picked up someone or something else along the way, as it seems like every house I've ever lived in has an interesting past. My childhood home was built on the land where the King Philip's War began, in Middleborough, Massachusetts. My very first house was in Rochester, Massachusetts, and that was built on land known to have unmarked graves where witches were buried alive and tortured. That house scared me and my family so much, we sold it the first chance we had and moved up to Maine, and the paranormal journey continued. Before I moved to Waterboro, I lived in Willowbrook Village in Newfield, Maine. That has some very interesting history, especially the very cantankerous man, Benjamin Franklin Dunnels. He still frequents the old area because he lost his land in a dispute back in the 1800s.
In 2013, I moved into the old Zachariah Dunnels house in Newfield, Maine. I was renting it for a few years while I was trying to buy a house. My landlord was a very busy man, but when we did talk, it was always interesting. One day he asked me out of the blue if I had seen the lady yet. I kind of had a feeling what he was referring to, as he had said when we first moved in, that he had the house blessed after the other tenant moved out. We were in a desperate situation and needed to leave the place we were currently renting, so I didn't care and didn't ask any more about it. Besides, we were living in an old Greek revival house directly inside of Willowbrook Village and Museum. How cool is that? I also worked in the kitchen for 2 years. It was directly across the street in the Trafton house. Another story of spooky happenings inside the historical Dr. Trafton house. I told him that I hadn't seen the lady, but I had seen the farmer. He looked stunned. He had always seen the lady that had lived there in the 1800s. Well, after some research, the farmer I saw was her husband. I knew the names at the time, but have forgotten. The historical information that my landlord had was all that was left, and he made a point to have any tenant that lived there post those historical records on the wall. He said it was out of respect for the house. Again, something he said, again, something he had said when I first moved in, but I didn't bother asking why. Eventually, I did see the lady. I was sitting in the living room and I saw a very distinct whitish outline of a woman in an old dress with an apron. She moved very fast through the dining room and kitchen and then disappeared. She didn't seem to notice me. I feel her energy was just residual, but still an amazing sight to witness. But I only saw her and the farmer once. Now, the farmer did see me. I was unpacking one night, and he was just staring at me through the window on the front porch. He had an old hat on, and he was young, and he was wearing clothes from the 1800s with suspenders. He stared at me as if he just wanted to see who was moving in. It startled me a little. Seeing something like that is a bit unnerving, no matter how many times you see it. But all was well, and the old house and neighborhood was just awesome, though I probably should have asked why he had the house blessed. I would soon find out. The house had a very dark heaviness to it. We heard little thumps and bangs, but it was an old house. Then my daughter heard someone with heavy boots walking through the kitchen. Nobody was even downstairs at the time. Then I started hearing the heavy boots in my bedroom, and then something sat on my bed. I could feel a heaviness by my feet, as if someone just sat down. During this time, I was still raising my family and hadn't delved too much into my abilities, so I just told it to go away and leave me alone. But it only got worse. The constant heavy footsteps in my room, dark shadows here and there, thumps and bangs on the wall, and I even got scratched. It was a little scratch, but it hurt. And my kids were coming to me with their own strange stories. Something pulled their hair when they were in bed, and one of my daughters was in her room alone, and the attic door, which was in her room, started shaking violently and then stopped. Life was busy during this time, so we just kind of lived with all that was going on, until it got even worse. One afternoon, I was having tea with my landlord, and he started telling me about the previous tenant and how one day, when he was over there visiting with her, 3 pictures on the wall came crashing down one by one in front of them. There was no explanation for it. He didn't divulge too much information about the incident, but I do know that the tenant was scared and left soon after, and the house had trouble keeping new tenants even to this day. Something darker lurks around Willowbrook Village. The activity continued, but now I was having unbelievable night terrors and sleep paralysis. I had never had those before. Vivid dreams, yes, but not these types of dreams. I would get pulled up to the ceiling by a dark, scary force in these dreams, and I just remember being very frightened. This was starting to go on every night until we finally moved. My next door neighbor told me that she hears the very same noises in her room as well. The heavy boots, someone sitting on the bed, shadows, unexplained noises. Her house is also part of the historical village, and she shared with me her information. A very angry man named Benjamin Franklin Dunnels owned much of that land, but there was some sort of dispute about it, and he lost it to someone else. The details are still available online in the history of Newfield, but a little spotty as the Dunnels family was from Massachusetts, and they moved back and forth a lot. And of course, records from that time were burned in the fire of 1947. According to my neighbor's research, he never got over losing his land, and she believes that Frank still stews in his anger between the two houses. I wish I knew more about Frank, but I couldn't find much. I don't believe he is a demon, just a very angry, negative energy. When we finally moved out, I was the last one in the house getting some of my stuff. I could feel his heavy presence and saw his dark, looming shadow behind me while I was grabbing boxes. I stood there to acknowledge him. The hairs were standing up on my arms and neck. He just stood there watching me get my things and leave. My guess is that he wanted to be sure that I left. It was his house after all. When my kids went back to the house to get the rest of their stuff, they saw a dark shadow lurking around one of the rooms and ran out of the house scared. So that was yet another eerie, heavily steeped in history house I lived in, where I could have picked up an attachment from there as well. I still have the other one that's still trying to tell me something in German. I really wish I knew what he was trying to tell me.
My sister and I were driving to a haunted walk in Lebanon, Maine, called Destination Haunt. And while we were in the town trying to find the place, we drove onto this really old dirt road called Lord Road. From the east, at the time we turned onto the road, it was day and the sun was out. As soon as we started driving down, the sky turned near black like night, as if the sun was setting and a fog engulfed the road. We quickly started joking about how this is like one of those wrong turn roads in these horror movies where a group of kids get lost in the woods and never leave. It added to the effect when we drove over an old wooden bridge suspended over a river. My sister acknowledged the narrowness of the road and asked how two cars could fit traveling in opposite directions. And I joked, well, no one ever leaves this place. In Maine, all you see are fields of trees for hundreds of miles at a time. But the trees on this road looked unusually different. They were all collectively old and had the color sucked right out of them. Their branches and bases curved in unusually zigzag patterns, unlike conventional trees that grow in a pattern to get the most sunlight. I drove a few miles until I had had enough of these massive puddles and decided to call the place we were trying to find. They told me their location was miles away on the west side of the road and to turn back because the east side was flooded, and we should enter the west end entrance located on the other side of the town instead. We turned around and saw a moose walking across the road, very normal in Maine. But right behind it was a 10-foot tall, black as can be, two-legged and unnaturally slim creature running unnaturally fast across the road. My sister screamed. It looked like Slender Man, only it had huge back jagged horns and had no apparent body features or shape to it. It looked like a 2D cutout of an unnatural human. When we drove by where he ran, we looked into the woods and saw it standing on two legs next to the moose. It leaned over in a hunchback manner and started walking around on all limbs, and there were others just like it, emerging from the mist. We drove the hell out of there, hoping my engine wouldn't seize from all the huge ass puddles. But on our way back, we saw two abandoned buildings with old cars from the 50s and 60s that rotted into the earth. Those houses were not there before we originally drove down. The creepiest part was when we got back to the main road, because the sun was almost set and the sky almost pitch black. When we pulled out of the road, the sun reappeared. The sky readjusted to day as if nothing ever happened. Later that night, I looked at Google Maps, and the road was completely different on there, filled with things that weren't there when we were driving, and all the houses looked new. After telling a few people about it, someone told me that Lebanon, Maine is known to have a lot of strange paranormal stuff happen. And there is this even a self-proclaimed witch fortune teller that lives there.